Sentire Media.
Hello everyone, and welcome to A History of Italy. Crossover Episode 1, Part 1, with Steve Guerra of the History of the Papacy on the Lombards. This week's episode represents a bit of a change of plan. As I was completing the episode with the Lombard League and the Italic League and their struggle against Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, I came upon a very specific source that I hadn't found on the Battle of Legnano. Since this is a very important battle for Italian history, especially connected to modern day-by-day history, I'd like to delve into it a little bit more. So, I'll leave you with the first part of a crossover episode I did with Steve Guerra of the History of the Papacy, in which we talked about the Lombards. I really miss those good old Lombards, so I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did talking about them once again.
Welcome back to a very special crossover episode with a History of Italy podcast and the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm Steve, host of the History of the Papacy podcast, and I'm joined by...
I'm Mike, and I am the host of a History of Italy podcast.
And then my podcast is the History of the Papacy podcast, which is a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome along with the Christian church. It's a kind of a grab bag. I do histories of, especially I talk a lot about the formation of the Bible, but along with the early foundation of Christianity. Now that I'm starting to go a little bit forward, there's a lot more talk about history that's happening inside of Italy. So our podcasts definitely run parallel to each other.
Absolutely. And one thing I've always appreciated, and I generally tell my listeners to go over and listen to your podcast for, is the theological aspect, which is very often over my head. And so I say, if you want to know about that, go over to the History of the Papacy and listen to that. So yeah, definitely, yeah, because Rome is, smack bang in the middle of Italy, and there's no getting around it, not only from a geographical point of view, but also from a political point of view. To this very day, I mean, Rome and the papacy influences Italian politics even today to a certain extent. Obviously not as much as in the past, but they're still there and they're still influencing things here.
Yeah, it really is amazing how the papacy and the church, the impact and the effect changes in each era of history. It's a little different, but it's still pretty deeply entwined in the bigger story.
Absolutely, definitely, yes. And from some moments when Italian history probably wouldn't proceed without the intervention of the papacy, to moments where they're sort of more of a bystander to events than in other times.
That really leads us into what we were going to what we plan on talking about today, which is the history of the Lombards in Italy. You did a really great series on them, and I thought I've been doing in my podcast little snippets, especially with experts such as yourself, on different political elements that were going on in Italy that affected the church and the popes. And the Lombards is a huge part of the story, and they're really complicated. What did you think about the Lombards just in general?
Well, I actually really enjoyed them. Obviously, as having gone to school in Italy, I did have an idea of who they were and what they'd done, but I really didn't get a feel of it until I was actually studying them. And obviously, it's interesting to look at Italians in Italy today and think that such a different people were part of the shared Italian history. I mean, we're talking Vikings, basically, people that came down from Scandinavia, then spent some centuries even making their way through Europe down to Italy, and it was very interesting to see that was such an important part of Italian history, and also for your listeners of the papacy, because we must remember that under the Lombards, the papacy really became a political force to reckon with, starting with Gregory the Great, which you've done a couple of episodes recently on, all the way down to the donation of Sutri, which was one of the main starting points of the Papal States, really. So they're definitely an interesting bunch, and I enjoyed them, and I was a bit sorry to see them go and those Franks coming in and pushing them out. And so, but they hung around a lot longer than one would expect, and there's traces of them to this day. So I enjoyed them very much.
Where did the Lombards come from exactly? They existed outside of the Roman Empire, and they came into Italy after the Western Roman Empire had fallen. They were kind of late in the later part of the whole migration game. What were they doing, say, in the maybe the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries before they came into Italy proper?
Well, it's hard to tell exactly what they were doing because they have no written history. Nothing was written down by the Lombards until they actually did get to Italy when they wrote down their laws, and maybe we'll talk about that later, the Edict of Rothari. But basically in that time they were wandering down Europe from Scandinavia, collecting bits here and there because the people that arrived in Italy in 568 in particular with King Alboin were not the people that started off from their original. They didn't even have the same name, actually, because they actually started off life as the Winili, which means something like either fierce in battle or demon dogs, because apparently they would wear, I don't know if they would chop off dogs' heads and wear them, or they would make dog masks or something like that, but some traces of Roman historians have had them looking like or wearing some kind of dog costume to make them more fierce in battle. And so as they came down, they actually met other tribes, other Germanic tribes, in some cases integrating, some cases clashing. And for example, the clash with the Vandals is where they changed their names to the Lombards, because basically they came up against these Vandals, and legend would have it that on the night before the battle, the Lombard women went to the goddess Freya, the wife of Wotan or Odin, the Germanic god of all gods, let's say, and asked for her help. And so basically Odin had promised that the winner of the battle between the Winili, or would become the Lombards, and the Vandals would be the first ones he saw on the morning of the battle. So Freya, his wife, suggested to the Lombard women that they should put their hair down in front of their faces and stand next to the Lombard men so their number looked greater, and then Odin would see them on the day. And so that they did, and it seems that Odin woke on that day, saw them, and asked himself, who are those warriors with the long beards? Now, long beards in German would be Langebärte, which in Italian became Longobardi, so the long beards, and that's why they changed their name from the Winili to Lombards in English, and they even gave their name to an existing Italian region, which is Lombardy, where Milan is the capital. So that's what they were doing, basically. They were making their way down, changing names, meeting and greeting other Germanic tribes, and in some cases clashing, some cases absorbing them into their social structure, let's say.
It's a pretty big deal to change the name of an entire region, especially in a place that's as well established as that northern part of Italy. How did they come? Did they come en masse with families, or was it more of just a warrior elite that had migrated?
Well, the first time they actually had a taste and experience of Italy was as part of the Byzantine invasion force that fought against the Goths in Italy. Up until that point, the Goths had held, for a couple of decades, had held Italy. And when the Byzantines, under the eunuch Narses, invaded Italy, Gothic Italy, they brought a contingent of Lombards with them, and that's where they experienced, where the Lombards had a taste of Italy for the first time. Apparently they were so naughty and raucous and misbehaved that they were sent off earlier than, they didn't get to see the end of the war, but they got to see Italy and they liked it. So when time came, at that time they would have been in what was known as Pannonia, which is a region sort of modern-day Austria, a little bit of Slovenia, just up on the border of Italy. And so when the time came and it was getting a bit crowded there, they were sort of pushing and shoving They'd done a bit of pushing and shoving with the Gepids, which are another sort of Gothic group, and now they were risking a push and shove with the Avars, and so they said, okay, well, rather than keep on staying here, we'll just go down to the land of milk and honey, and taking over Italy was a relatively easy task by that time because it had been devastated and was sort of chafing under the yoke of Byzantine rule, and so it was a pretty easy thing to come down and to take over quite a bit of the peninsula.
Is that why it happened so fast? Because there was a vacuum in the peninsula where the Byzantines weren't 100% committed and the Ostrogoths were pretty much wiped out? Is that what made it so easy for them to go into the Italian peninsula and take over so rapidly?
That's definitely part of it, yeah. The administration under Narses was very unpopular. The country during the Gothic War had suffered from... So not only had there been the Gothic War, but you'd also had famine, you'd had pestilence, so the people were decimated. There were certain areas of Italy which had been completely and totally depopulated. The area where I live, for example, Emilia, everyone had migrated down to the sea. And in many cases, there was just nobody to oppose the Lombards. The Byzantines, as you were saying, Steve, weren't that dedicated. Narses had a terrible time trying to rebuild the rubble of a country that had suffered years and years of war with very little finances as well. So he'd had to sort of tax the pants out of the poor locals, and obviously they weren't loving that. So it really was relatively simple for the Lombards to come in to Italy and invade Italy, because it was different, because whereas the Goths came in as what would be called federati, sort of allies of the empire, the Lombards were an actual invasion force, so they had no sort of illusion of being allies with the empire. They would have come in, let's say, the second time, not as a band of warriors affiliated with an invasion force, but that would have been sort of a mass migration. Now, obviously, numbers there are almost impossible, but the one I see recurring most often is about 150,000 people, which is, not so much considering the local population as well. But they came in and they were able to become the elite of the country and to take over the positions of power. And it was one case in which really those that suffered most from an invasion, once the invasion was over, were those at the top. So the Italian or Roman nobles were either killed or exiled, whereas once the invasion had finished, the lower levels of societies didn't have a terrible time of it, also because they had sort of similar social situations, economic situations, without the Byzantine taxes. So you could say, in a certain sense, things improved a bit for the lower levels of society.
You might say that the lower levels, they weren't maybe ecstatic about it, but it was kind of the same thing, different people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the initial invasion would have been something terrible with the pillaging and sacking, but if you were able to survive that, then it wasn't as bad as maybe it was under the Byzantines, where you had all of the problems of daily life in the early Middle Ages, plus very heavy Byzantine taxations, which the Lombards didn't apply.
Where did the Lombards obviously came in through the north? Where were their major power centers? Well, once they were in the Italian peninsula?
Well, they came in through the northeast, in the area of Cividale, that was once known as the Julian Alps, basically. And that was actually where they left their first duke. The name duke comes from the term dux, which is a Roman term meaning leader or commander. And so the first duke was set there in Cividale, and as I say in my podcast, King Alboin, who took the Lombards in, actually did something which my children never managed to do, which is shut the door behind him, in the sense that he created a fortification there in Cividale against future invasions. Indeed, the future problems for the Lombards didn't come from that area, but then came from the west, from the Franks. And so basically, as they came down, well, we really need to take a step back, because one thing we need to say about the Lombards is they were not a united people, really. Alboin was only actually the second king that had managed to unite them as a people. And they were really off doing their own thing. They had all different groups. The tribal groups of the Lombards were called fare, one fara, a single fara. And so everybody was really off doing their own thing once they'd settled. So the main centers, they in some cases, they used existing cities. So, for example, Verona, Pavia, Milan. In other cases, they would create other centers. So, for example, there was an important Roman city which was Aquileia, and they didn't settle Aquileia, but it settled nearby and created their own city. They would create settlements in areas, obviously, as people have done since ancient times, around rivers, around crossings, around bridges. And so in the north, they had those centers. And going further south, they went as far south as Benevento and Spoleto. And those are two big names because the dukes of Benevento and Spoleto, in all of the history of the Lombards, were always causing some kind of trouble. All of the dukes were very, very ready to try and be as independent as they could. But in particular, the dukes of Benevento and Spoleto were quite far off. They were cut off by what became then the Papal States and what were the remaining Byzantine holdings. So they were far enough to do their own thing and cause trouble without the king trying to intervene. Indeed, at the beginning, the Lombards got rid of they didn't elect any kings after their second king in Italy, which was Clef. He died in 574. And so between 574 and 584, they did without kings. They said, okay, well, everybody do your own thing, everybody manage your own bit of the country. But then with the Franks looming ever present over in the west, they said, okay, maybe we need a king. And then back in 584, they elected Authari as king, and from then on they had a central power in the king from then on until the end of their reign. But for example, the dukes, the duchies of Spoleto and Benevento actually survived beyond the fall of the northern Lombard Empire as well, so they were quite important historically.
I guess to fill in the timeline a little bit, what happened at that time in the northern part of their kingdom? After they had settled, they made a unified kingdom. But then when the Franks hit the scene, why did the Franks come in and have a conflict with the Lombards in the northern part of Italy?
Well, that depends how far you want to go down the line, because I know that in your podcast, Steve, you're sort of just getting to the Lombards. But, well, basically the Franks had always been peeking over the Alps, let's say. Also in the times of the Gothic War, they had done a little bit of raiding coming in. So one of the tasks of Narses, of the Byzantine ruler, when he'd won the Gothic War, was to get rid of the Franks. So, one was just basically northern Italy. In particular, the Po Valley, it's a very fertile area. And it's the only area, if you have a chance to look on a map, the Po Valley is the only non-mountainous fertile area of Italy, and it's very good for farming, and it has the Po River running through the center, so it's always been an area that's ripe for conquest, basically. But in time, the Franks came to the aid of the Papacy. Obviously, we're looking quite a bit down the line, and in the end, the Lombard kingdom of the north actually fell because of their continuous, let's say, encroachment on papal lands and the risk that the Pope saw in being absorbed by the Lombard kingdom. And so that's why once he'd understood, to say the Pope at the moment, understood that there was no more help coming from the Byzantine Empire, then he started to look towards the Franks, and that's when they got the excuse to come and invade and encroach on those lands, those important lands as well. And in those years, they were basically setting up a kingdom. So, they slowly managed to settle, so to move from a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer culture that had basically breeding and farming of animals to a more sedentary agricultural culture. And then later on down the line with another important king, which was Rothari, they set their laws down in writing. And interestingly, those laws made it, for quite a few centuries, the Franks themselves actually used the Lombard code of law of Rothery, and then later extended, let's say, by other kings, for example, Aripert and Liutprand in particular. They set down these laws, and they were very important up until basically Roman law was discovered in the university period. So you're talking, the 11th, 12th centuries. You still had people claiming to live and abide by Lombard law. So centuries after the Edict of Rothery, which was around 653, mid 600s, let's say. So they were setting up shop, you can say.
That's a good jump into what was their governmental structure in Italy, and generally how did they establish their government, and how did they rule, especially when they're ruling over mostly the local Roman population, Latin, non-Germanic population. How did they interact with them, and how did they organize themselves?
Well, basically at the beginning they found these strange creatures, these Romans that weren't warriors, and they were normal citizens doing, being farmers or artisans and things like that. So they didn't really initially fit into the whole Lombard philosophy, because if you were a Lombard, you were part of three groups. So the top group, the top social strata, let's say, were that of the Arimanni, who were the sort of noble warrior lords. Under the Arimanni, you had the Aldi, who were free men, but in some way dependent on the Arimanni, and then you had basically the serfs. And the local Roman population really didn't fit into this structure, so it took a little bit of adapting. But once the Lombards did start to settle down and move to a more sort of agricultural culture, they found that they needed the help of the Roman, let's call them Roman for lack of, Roman or Italian administrators to manage what they'd taken over. And so they were there, the administrators were there and they're ready. And so we see from the beginning of the Lombard conquest more integration, whereas the Goths had actually tried to keep everything separate and made completely different law systems for Goths or for the Romans. With the Lombards, we see a greater level of integration. One thing that's always interesting for us is drinking. And so the drinking habits, the Lombards came in as drinkers of let's say, beer or mead or, whatever passed for beer back then. They moved in, and slowly in time, especially the upper levels, took to drinking wine. And indeed, by the time of the Edict of Rothery, so we're looking not that long after, about 70 years after the initial invasion, there's no trace of regulations and laws regarding beer, but lots of regulations and laws regarding the protection of vineyards, for example. So they came and they settled and they started to take up local culture and even language, because by the 8th century, the Lombard language actually disappeared. So, we have no real written trace of what kind of language they actually spoke, although we can assume it was something akin to, Anglo-Saxon, Old English, or Proto-Germanic, or one of those Germanic languages, let's say. Well, I hope you enjoyed that first part of the conversation with Steve, and I'll be releasing part 2 of that next week to fit into our usual scheduling time, which I'm told is pretty good for the average commute. Then, after that, we'll be back on track with Barbarossa and his struggle with the northern communes. Also, there's another crossover collaboration in the works, so listen out for that. It should be very, very interesting. Until then, thanks very much to everyone for listening. Remember that, as always, you can get in touch, hello@ahistoryofitaly.com, and at the same URL, ahistoryofitaly.com, you can click through to our social media. We are on Twitter and Facebook, or look at timelines and maps and everything you need to navigate our country's complicated history. Thank you very much for listening again, and until next time, arrivederci.
Sentire Media.
Hey, podcast producers and show hosts. Do you want to join a podcast network that celebrates all things Italian? At Sentire Media, we understand the allure of Italy and its unique culture. Our devoted team of hosts and producers are all driven by their shared passion for Italy. And we work tirelessly to create the best lifestyle podcasts and content that will whisk you away to the very heart of Italy. With us, you can savor the mouth-watering flavors, get lost in the stories from the past, break down the cultural barriers, and truly immerse yourself in the vibrant traditions of this intoxicating country. If you have a great podcast idea or are already in production and would like to join Sentire Media, head over to sentiremedia.com, that's SENTIRE media.com, and find out how to submit your show.